Okay, so as with the other, modulatory neurotransmitters, these classical neurotransmitters we've been discussing, including acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine, right? Serotonin also has a brainstem source, a nucleus in the brainstem, nuclei in the brainstem, whose axons sort of project more widely in the brain and release serotonin in other parts of the brain, of the cerebrum. The nucleus or the nuclei in the brainstem that are the source of serotonergic output in other parts of the brain these are known as the raphe nuclei. The raphe nuclei are the serotonergic source in the brainstem, for release actually of serotonin in other, synapses in other places in the brain. And, what's interesting is you should note that for all of the neurotransmitters, all of these classical neurotransmitters we've been discussing, they do have these brainstem nuclei, right? There's specific nuclei for dopamine. Remember the VTA and the substantia nigra, and there are specific projections, obviously. There's the nigrostriatal pathway for movement in particular, but there's also the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways, which have a lot to do with motivation. And, we are now learning there's a lot more complexity in terms of the role of both, nigrostriatal and mesolimbic, mesocortical sort of combined role in both movement and more motivation. But then there's also the locus coeruleus, which is a brainstem nucleus, for the release of norepinephrine all around the brain, many, many locations. Remember, that's a very unusual kind of system in that there are few neurons, very few noradrenergic neurons, but they have a great amplification of their influence and effect because they have all those swellings right along the axons that have all the release machinery, the voltage-gated calcium channels, the vesicles, the vesicular transporters, the docking complexes to, allow for exocytosis all the way along the length of those axons. So they have great amplification, of activity. So if the locus coeruleus fires off, right? Remember, bam, you can get a startle response and orient, to something external. And then, of course, the cholinergic system is, complex in that there's also a basal forebrain source, like in the frontal lobe, for, projections around the cortex, around the cerebrum, and release of neurotransmitter of acetylcholine in these areas. Very important for, memory and cognition. But there's also a brainstem source, like these others that we're describing, right? It's called the PPT, and it projects into the thalamus. And it's kind of interesting because it's, it switches on selectively when you're in a dreaming sleep. Now, there's, when you have structural features that are sort of shared like this, like, brainstem nuclear sources, nuclei, right, for, the release of dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and serotonin, and then sort of widespread projections and release of those specific neurotransmitters, right, the monoamines and acetylcholine, all around the brain. Well, that suggests some sort of a maybe shared functional role. Well, there's, specific functional roles we've been discussing, with each of these individual neurotransmitters. Collectively, they serve what we call a modulatory role. They kind of modulate your level of alertness and arousal. So when you're awake, engaged, able to focus, participate, etc. Typically, the PPT for acetylcholine, the VTA, the substantia nigra for dopamine, the locus coeruleus for norepinephrine, and the raphe nuclei for serotonin are, firing. They're active. They're engaged. Right? There's lots of activity. They're modulating the activity of the brain. And then when you start to get sleepy, these systems start to slow. The frequency of action potentials drops. And then when you get into a deep, deep sleep, they're effectively, pretty much off. And then remember, if you switch into like kind of a dream state, right, into more of a REM sleep that's often associated with dreams, you'll get selective reactivation, switching on of these cholinergic projections from the PPT. That also has the effect of, often paralyzing you too, so you can't move in your dream. Ambien, a drug that we talked about earlier, may have some influence over, dysregulation of these processes. But collectively, these are modulatory neurotransmitters. They can modulate your level